Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to the 1-year anniversary of the launch of the Xbox Series X and technically Xbox Series S. If you're watching this the day it came out, it is November 10th, 2021, and yes, it has already been an entire year of this. Before we go into the details of this video though, I just want to ask you guys for a favor. If you could please like this video, comment on the video, subscribe to this channel, and if you've been watching me for years, you know I do videos like this all the time every year. I love doing the anniversary stuff. I love making lots of retro gaming content in general. So if you've appreciated that, I would appreciate your support. In the description, I've got all my social media stuff, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all that. But I also created an entirely new channel all about flying and eating. It has nothing to do with video games, but I think you guys might enjoy it if you just kind of like the idea of seeing what else is out in the world, since I am constantly on planes, and I thought people might enjoy seeing other random things around the world, including lots of gaming media events and so on and so forth. I know I said it has nothing to do with games, but it can, because I go to a lot of stuff. Anyway, so there's a channel link in the description. Please go there and subscribe to that. I would really appreciate that, just so I can get that channel rolling. And of course, subscribe to this one if you've never been here before. But that said, let's talk about this, what we're all here for. The Xbox Series X is actually 1 year old already. And there's a lot to say. Typically what I talk about is, the last year, what it's been like, policies, games, sort of some of that stuff, as well as predictions for the future. Now, it's kind of hard to do that without comparing it to the obvious, which is the PlayStation 5. And the PS5 will, of course, get its own video in 2 days, at the time, that this is coming out, on November 12th, 2021, when that is its first birthday. But when I say that, I don't just mean that because, they're competitors, but because they're very similar. And historically speaking, when you have two consoles that are competitors, they try to be really different from each other. Like the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis or whatever, that's the most historically infamous example. They really fight it out over different games and different policies and all sorts of stuff. Microsoft and Sony, especially this time around, in a lot of ways they're different, and in a lot of ways they're the same as each other. And I would actually go so far as to say that while they obviously are competition, and of course we have to think about Nintendo, granted the Switch isn't relevant until March, at least for these videos purposes, the three of them don't really seem to see each other as competitors. Like, Nintendo operates entirely now within like the handheld sphere. Like, obviously the Switch works on a television and all that, but they don't really seem to care about that. Microsoft and Sony look at Nintendo and go, yeah, it can have The Witcher 3, but who really cares? Like, we have superior versions, blah, blah, blah. So they're in their own corner. So then when it comes to Sony and Nintendo looking at each other, they kind of go like, I would argue that Sony looks at Microsoft like, well, that's cute, but, we've got Japan, and we're going to do things very traditional with our normal console, where a console comes out and it has its own library of games, and they're following the tried and true formula. And they look at Microsoft like, what are you doing? And like, whatever, you do you. Well, Microsoft kind of looks at everybody and goes like, who wants to play? And that is both good and bad. And what I mean by that is, it's good in the sense that Microsoft looks at all their competitors and it's like, hey, you want to work with us? Let's do stuff. So they go to Nintendo. They're like, hey, let's share IPs. Let's get some stuff going. Whatever. They basically dominate PC now. I mean, granted, yes, Steam is a competitor, but like Microsoft doesn't really care. They operate within the PC ecosystem, and the same goes now with Xbox being like, hey, this is the console ecosystem. The closest, and I mean, granted, you don't see Microsoft titles popping up on PlayStation, but I almost wonder if we're getting to that point where Microsoft's just going to reach out and be like, hey, you want to have Halo? Like, you want Game Pass installed on PS5? We don't care. That's a very strange business model, but it has been the model that they've really been going for the past few years. So that's why it's kind of odd to talk about the Series X as a console, because while it obviously is, it doesn't feel like one. And I don't mean it feels like a gaming PC or anything like that. What I mean by that is, if you go back and watch my initial thoughts, when this first came out, when I first got it, I did an unboxing right away, and I did my initial review. One of the first things I said about it was, it didn't really feel like a next-gen console. What it felt like was a physical firmware update. The ports on the back use all the exact same stuff as at least an Xbox One X. So you can just disconnect everything and reconnect all that stuff and just plug it in. As soon as you installed your account and all that, download some updates here and there, get it all kind of initialized, you were right back in the same ecosystem. Like, the dashboard is identical, the game compatibility, for the most part, is identical. And so it just felt like a physical firmware upgrade because now you have better hardware. So you had games that were like, oh yeah, they ran on your Xbox One, and now they run better. They run a little faster. They potentially have higher resolution, better textures, that kind of thing. To further that point, within the last year, if you look at their game library, we are still at a point where there are basically no Xbox Series X specific games. I know you're probably like, what are you talking about? I go in stores and I see Xbox games all the time. Are you crazy? No. What you see is Xbox ecosystem games. So let me elaborate on that. If you go into like any game store, or even if you go on digitally, you go online and try to check out games, the idea Microsoft has had with the Xbox for quite some time now was, let's keep everything within one bubble of gaming and just kind of make everything cross-compatible. Perfect example. So I'm going to put on a game here. This is Super Monkey Ball Banana Mania. I want to thank Sega for providing a copy of this. Now, this game is an Xbox Series X game. Despite what I just said, it is an Xbox Series X game. That's where they would promote it. That's what they would say that it is. And it is obviously enhanced as such on that platform. However, this game does very much run on the Xbox Series S, the inferior version of this. It also runs on the Xbox One X. It runs on the Xbox One S, and it even runs on the base VCR Xbox One from 2013. I mean, yes, obviously that's the point, though. You know, the modern version running on a Series X will be the most attractive. It will have the best resolutions, best frame rate, etc. But technically, it's within the same Xbox ecosystem bubble that stretches currently at the time of recording from the Xbox One VCR to the Xbox Series X. That's 7 years of hardware development from 2013 to 2020, and yet same game works across all versions. And so you can see this in the physical media as well. Now, come here to the table for a second, and you'll see I've got a copy of Shenmue 1 and 2 re-release that says Xbox One on it. Because at the time, that was the system. They were doing the more traditional Sony model, if you want to call it that, of this is our next generation console, and this is the name we put on it. But when they did the Series X, they decided rather than, and you know, Phil Spencer himself, who's the head of the Xbox division, famously said, like, we're looking to go beyond generations. This is a very tangible example of what he meant by that. They didn't get rid of the format, they just dropped the name. Now, if you look at a copy of Yakuza, which is technically an Xbox Series X game, it just says Xbox. All the stuff that comes out now just says Xbox as an ecosystem. Sure, it has a little, notes that says it's on the Series X, but it also very clearly says that it works on the Xbox One. That's what's strange about it. So if you pull back to me right now, you'll notice I've only got those two games on the table, and there's a reason for that. It's interesting to think we are a year out, and there's almost no games actually specifically designed for the Xbox Series X that only work on the Series X. There are some, just not many. Off the top of my head, the only one I can even think of is Flight Simulator. And the only reason I think that's the case is that really was a very high-demanding PC game originally. And so, like, the Series X would be the only version of the Xbox that could even run that. So they were like, okay, fine. And it's an inferior version, I'm sure, to the PC edition, but still, the fact that they got it running is cool. That's about it. There's a couple here and there, but there's just not many. And I'm not saying those are good or bad things, just observations. Have you ever seen a console work like that ever in the history of gaming? Where, this is not the Amiga CD32. This isn't some obscure thing that was only able to pump out a couple of games in about a year. This is one of the world's most dominant video game platforms. And yet, it has almost no software specifically for it. Almost all of its games are either cross-compatible on PC, cross-compatible on other versions of the Xbox ecosystem, have versions available to the Switch even, and of course the PS5. In fact, it is very possible, I don't know, I mean, we're too early out. It is very possible, and I could already be wrong about this, I just don't know all the examples off the top of my head, but this could actually be the first gaming console in history to literally never have an exclusive game on it. I think down the road, the Xbox Series X will just be another piece in the line. It's just, at one point it was the upper echelon of the Xbox ecosystem, but that it won't stay that way. So to roll that back just slightly, I think you have to understand that it's also sort of competing with itself in the Xbox Series S. Now, I didn't mention the Xbox Series S other than the little cameo there because I don't own one and because I don't really care about it, but it's important to acknowledge it. The Xbox Series S was supposedly anyway, the all-digital version of the same console for about $200 less. Now, Sony did this same type of tactic where they released a physical edition that uses disc as well as a digital edition of the console, but the price difference there is $100 instead of $200. Now, we can elaborate more on the PlayStation side of things in its own dedicated video, but in this video, I think it's important to understand that for most of us out there, that the Xbox Series S is not actually the same console as the Series X. It's the half step between the Xbox One X and the Xbox Series X, in that it's more capable than the Xbox One X, but less capable than the Series X. And the Xbox One X in of itself was actually just a half step between the Xbox One and eventually the Xbox Series X. So it's like you have the base VCR, its logical successor should have been this machine. But they made these little increments as they were going, and then they kind of just broke them in two separate places and said, this is one half, this is the other half. But the Series S, to talk about that for a second, I don't own one, and I have no intention of ever getting one because it's an entirely digital platform. But it's a digital platform with, I think, with a very specific intention. If you've seen my videos in the past talking about the PS5 and the Xbox Series line, and the reason they did two platforms, each one of them did this, it seems obvious to me that both of them would prefer a digital future because they have greater control over the content released, they have greater control over the pricing. It's essentially a monopoly, while claiming it isn't, because a game can be ported to different ecosystems, and that it might be available on Steam, it can be available on Xbox's distribution system, Sony's distribution system, or Nintendo, so you can technically consider that competition. But what you eliminate in that process is, well, Best Buy is no longer the one selling you the copy versus Target versus Walmart versus Amazon versus whatever. You have less competition as the buyer because you can only buy the game you want for the system you want from literally one choice. That's the process of digital distribution. Now, I know PC is a little different because you have things like Steam, Epic, and GOG, but PC is an open platform. The Xbox is not. So Microsoft is never going to allow a competitor to digitally distribute games legitimately on Xbox hardware. And that's what kind of makes it a little different. Hence, I don't want an Xbox Series S, ever. I just don't support digital gaming. But that said, I feel like the reason you go after that console is because currently anyway, it's really the only one that's available. That's one thing that the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series right now actually do have in common, is they're both really suffering from hardware shortages. That has to be one of the most bizarre things about this past year, is that rather than talk about all like the great gaming experiences and policy changes and all that sort of stuff that normally you would talk about after 1 year, we're really still talking about like, dude, when can I just go into a store and buy one? Now, there's obviously everybody's familiar with what's going on with shortages, and there are a multitude of different reasons for that, and nothing I say will change any of that. It's just kind of fascinating that we're at a point in time where it's been a year and you still can't walk into a store and get one of these. Now, Microsoft is a little less guilty than Sony, but that's only because A, nobody wants the Series S, so they just sit there, and B, because frankly, everybody does actually want a PS5, regardless of which version it is. Now, the Series S was, I think, kind of an interesting one because it essentially tried to cater to, I think, very specific groups as opposed to just being the cheaper alternative. It's the cheaper alternative for the people who don't really know what they're getting into. You look at it and see that it's $200 cheaper, like, oh, it's $200 less, that's good enough for little Billy, who really cares? Or you're like, hey man, I just don't have the extra $200 without really thinking through why it's not a good idea to bother with it. You might also be the guy who's like, hey, that's what's available, dude, so I'm going to pick one up. You know, and then you could also be, honestly, I think one of the number one audiences, if I was a parent, which I am not, the Xbox Series S would only really be useful to me as, in the same way a Mad Catz controller would be useful to me, which is buy it to give to a kid knowing full well that you don't really care what happens to it. And I realize that seems kind of exorbitant for a child to just be given an Xbox Series S. But my point is, there's much less they can break on it, and it's much less capable because it's digital, but it runs inferior versions of the games, and it's cheaper, and it's just not as much of a problem. And that's kind of the basic motto of like a Mad Catz controller. So all I'm really saying is, well, and then the other group actually is, by the way, is emulation enthusiasts, because the Xbox Series S admittedly is quite good at that. Series X is better at it, but it costs $200 more, hence people don't think about it that way. But in that context, the only reason you like it is not for what the Series S itself is doing as a game console. You like how it's able to run things behind it as far as backwards compatibility, be it legitimate or illegitimate through emulation. All that's to say is none of those things matter to me, and that's why I don't have an Xbox Series S. Not knocking anybody that does, but in my opinion, if you ask me, and I said this all the way back last year when I was talking about the digital versus physical stuff, I believe wholeheartedly that both of them were betting, Sony and Microsoft were betting on one of the two to win out this generation, be it physical or digital media, and that they were really just putting these out there and saying like, we don't want to be the company that didn't give them a choice, because if we have only a physical edition of the console, there will be a devout fan base of people who are like, why am I paying an extra $100 for a disc drive I am never going to use? It seems archaic. Like the way Apple convinced everybody that a headphone jack on a phone was a bad thing, and that it made it feel like an archaic old piece of junk. You don't want to be the company going out there and saying like, hey, look, we have old technology in ours. At the same time, you don't want to be the one going out there going full digital, because you're like, people are the exact opposite philosophy. You're like, great, so none of my stuff in the past works. I don't really own my games, blah, 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 blah. So that's why both of them just put both out there and said, like, let's see how it works. Now, each of their strategies was different, and we'll talk more about Sony's in their own video, but in short, theirs was, we'll make it $100 cheaper. It looks a little bit nicer as far as, like, the actual console, and we'll just hope that people embrace that. Where Microsoft really went different with it, with a completely different design, cheaper design, all that sort of stuff. But they were really betting on Game Pass. And that is its whole own thing that we'll be talking about momentarily. But yeah, so I think really that I said this like a year ago, that at one point, one of those two versions will be dropped. Whether I maintain in both cases it's like 2 to 3 years, so now it'll be about like 1 to 2 years from now probably, that we'll just suddenly hear Microsoft is no longer manufacturing the Xbox Series S, or Sony is no longer manufacturing the PS5 digital edition. But it could have been the other way around, where it was like Microsoft is making a new Xbox Series S that's more capable and dropping the Series X entirely, and Sony was going to drop the PS5 physical edition entirely. All I'm trying to say is, I feel like both of them put both of the versions out there, hoping the digital one would outperform, and then being able to discontinue the physical edition because of monopolistic reasons, as I cited before. Because if a physical edition of a console wins, it's not that big of a deal, because they can recall the digital ones, they stop making them, they're like, hey, you bought a digital version of our console, no big deal, all the games are still going to be sold digitally online, nothing changes for you. But in the reverse of that, if you're like, hey man, I bought the physical edition of this and you're telling me you're not making disc-based games, look to HD DVD as the example of what happens in those situations. They say sorry, they give you a $50 gift card and say keep enjoying movies, or in this case games, and here's a gift card to Xbox and have fun. Like that's that. But the good news for us physical enthusiasts, it seems after about a year that the high demand seems to still be on the physical side of things. But don't get it twisted. Despite all this pro-physical discussion I'm having, I fervently believe, and it's inevitable, that digital content will win. It's just a matter of when. And I'm just going down with the ship. I'm all physical edition. But with that said, we have to talk about the most obvious thing, the most obvious aspect of anything that is Xbox and its ecosystem. Game Pass. Now, Game Pass, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, because it seems like every single person that has an Xbox, be it Xbox One all the way to Series X, has Xbox Game Pass installed. I feel like if Microsoft could get away with installing it on the 360, they would do it. It's just, it would be too difficult because it would be so limited in what it could actually run. But that said, I feel like that's how much they're invested in it. And that kind of makes sense for their whole strategy, is everything, we have to keep it within the Xbox brand, the Xbox bubble, everything coexists, everything works on everything else, with a handful of exceptions here and there. And Game Pass kind of gives them this option where they can kind of lure people in and say, hey, look, buy our hardware. Even if you buy the cheaper hardware, you can run our Game Pass service, which we give away for like a freaking $1. Granted, it goes up after a while. And you can download whatever you want, play whatever you want, delete whatever you want. It's like Netflix of gaming. It's just there. You can constantly use it. Now, as I said, I am super strong into physical media. Game Pass has no temptation to me, like none. Like I'm more likely to start saying, "Hey guys, I want to go farming today." Like, do I look like I farm? No. Like I just don't care about Game Pass. I'm sorry, I just don't. But I don't represent everybody. In fact, in this case, I very much represent the vast, vast minority. Most people love Game Pass. Everybody just seems to universally love it who actually has it. And even some of my friends who are like super into physical editions are like, dude, Game Pass, man. Like, games I want are on there day one. I play them. I don't pay anything special for it, and I delete it, and I go, I don't need to buy it, whatever. Or I liked it enough to buy it. Whatever your reasons are, that's all fine. I'm not arguing the merits of Game Pass one way or the other. I'm simply saying, like, it is a good service now for those in that who like to do things that way, but it is ultimately a digital rental service, and that's fine. You know that going in for the most part, I believe. What concerns me is the longevity of it. I like preservation. You know, if you follow me outside of this video and you've seen other things, I mean, like, I help to preserve prototypes, like the Nintendo PlayStation prototype, the Sega Pluto prototype. I like history, and I want stuff like that preserved. Entirely digital gaming scares me because, like, stuff will just get lost. But that's only one factor. The other element of it is really just how long can that business model actually work to the customer's advantage. You have to understand, Game Pass is cheap because they still have to compete with physical media. They still have to compete with stores, brick and mortar stores that are selling people stuff like this. If the all-digital version of an Xbox Series S or PS5 had won, and it's not like it couldn't still happen that way, by the way, but if it does, or if it eventually does in a generation after this, when you have Game Pass and they are your only distribution method, as I alluded to earlier, they also can control all the prices. They have no reason to cut you in on a great deal anymore once you have no other choices, or at least you have far fewer choices. Because imagine a scenario where you're like, all right, dude, I loved Xbox, I loved the Game Pass, it was great, there are new ones coming up, yeah, it doesn't have disc drives anymore, but whatever, I've been using Game Pass for the past few years, I can't remember the last time I bought a disc, who really cares, the subscription fee is so low, blah, 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 I'm gonna get their new one. So you buy the new system, you love it, you're like, this is going to be great, and Game Pass is like, okay, cool, your Game Pass works, but we're upping the fee, and we're upping it again. Like the way Netflix has been kind of systematically doing that for, forever, to the point where you're like, the games are much more expensive than they used to be, the service kind of sucks now, but I don't have a choice, because there's no other way for me to get games on it. Now, I'm not saying this will 100% happen, but that is kind of my fear with anything like that. So be aware that that kind of stuff can happen. So that kind of addresses my projections. But if you want to go back to like media projections about this particular console, the thing is, I don't know if it really has anything special about it in of itself. That's the weirdest thing about it, is that it's like, its history is it's just the upgraded version of a system that has existed really since 2013, and very likely will not be the last of its own family. So eventually, we'll be in this weird situation where the Xbox Series X really was nothing. It was just like a stepping stone between whatever the Xbox One, and whatever ultimately is their final piece of dedicated hardware before Xbox Game Pass becomes its own digital distribution system and all that sort of stuff. But that's, I think, really a bizarre thing. But rather than talk about all this like vague possibility of all these things occurring, let's talk about some short-term changes that might happen. Now, policy-wise, Microsoft didn't really change much over the last year. Usually I have a term for this, which is they didn't rock the boat. But within a launch year, you would think they would be doing that. But as I said, physical firmware upgrade. All they're really doing is delivering the exact same ecosystem experience, adding more content to it, and just kind of keeping it stable. And they're not really changing much. The only two things that have really kind of floated, and by the way, at the time, I put this out here, this might already be out of date because, they might announce this like suddenly. They might be doing more backwards compatibility. That would actually be great, and that would actually make a lot of sense given the whole Xbox ecosystem concept. which is to say they might add more 360 games, and they might even add more original Xbox games, which would be fantastic. You know, I'm kind of, you know, I love the idea. It might sound like I'm being overly negative about all this Xbox ecosystem stuff, but I actually think it's great. Like, the idea that this one device could play all my Series X compatible games, all of its Xbox One games minus Kinect stuff, or at least a lot of Xbox 360 stuff, as well as a lot or all of the original Xbox content. That's amazing. You know, it really is. And I could even see if they made it like that and then said, hey, everybody, this is all on Game Pass now, and it's only like, you know, a couple bucks a month. It's gonna be really hard for anyone who isn't me to ignore that, because that's an amazing deal for now. And that's the key there. But the only other thing that it really is to say about them over the last year and upcoming plans is probably what they've always done, which is more acquisitions of companies. Microsoft doesn't traditionally develop a whole lot of stuff in-house. Certainly there are exceptions to that. But for the most part, they just buy up developers and then just kind of bring them into the system. Famously, Bethesda was only a year ago. And so people are getting surprised, like, what, the next Elder Scrolls isn't going to come to PS5? Yeah, duh. Why would Microsoft spend the money to do that? Like, it'll come out on their system. It'll come out on their sort of other system in the form of PC. I wouldn't even be surprised, due to cooperation with Nintendo, if it ends up being some sort of really gimped version that runs on Nintendo hardware just cuz. But that's kind of a long shot right there. I do think that Microsoft is set for some other big acquisition. Don't know what it would be, but my number one, like, Hail Mary, I keep using the sports analogies for a channel of people that I'm sure don't watch much sports, but my Hail Mary one would be EA. Now, that's crazy. I get it. To an extent, it is. But if, I mean, like, who else? It's like them or Activision are the only big other ones that I think that they might actually have some realistic chance of going for. EA, to me, would make a lot of sense because it would come with a lot of, like, well, first of all, there's a lot of cooperation between the two brands. They have a long history of working together. It would come with a lot of sports stuff, which would be surprising. Again, we don't here probably care much about the sports stuff, but sports stuff moves the casuals. And if the casuals get behind the Xbox more than they get behind the PlayStation, that's a lot. But ultimately, all of this is very North American centric. I would say that all of Xbox's strategies are really designed for the United States and to a lesser extent Canada, and then just kind of have windfall possibilities in Europe, very specifically the UK more so than mainland Europe, and to a lesser extent Australia. I think Microsoft has pretty much all but given up on Japan and most of Asia. I mean, the console didn't even launch in most of those places. I think, you know, I mean, we don't need to go down a history lane on what went wrong in Japan, but I don't know, man. Times are changing, and it's very interesting to see how Microsoft is not so much going with the trajectory. They're like kind of creating the trajectory, whether we like it or not. And so basically it boils down to which team are you on? Do you like it or not? That's really about it. So yeah, that'll about do it, I think, for this particular video. Please stay tuned to the PS5 video where we'll talk about its history over the last year and predictions and games and all sorts of stuff. Again, please like, comment, subscribe, go into the description, check out all the social media stuff, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, all that. And please, once again, if you could, do me a favor, subscribe to my new channel, even if you don't really think you're going to watch it. Maybe you will, maybe you'll like it, but I also just kind of need the support so that I can kind of get the channel rolling. So thank you very much. The link's there. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.